Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Catherine Bracey, founder and CEO of Tech Equity Collaborative. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. We are just waiting a couple of minutes to let the room fill up, and we'll start shortly. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Catherine Bracey. I'm Tech Equity's CEO and founder. We are just waiting a couple of minutes to let the room fill up. We will start shortly. Okay, hello everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Again, I'm Catherine Bracey. I'm Tech Equity's founder and CEO, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this conversation with Malcolm Harris, who's the author of the new book, Palo Alto. Before we get into our conversation with Malcolm, I just wanted to introduce those of you who are new to Tech Equity to our work. So Tech Equity's mission is to investigate economic equity issues within the tech sector and those that are caused by tech products and business models. And we raise awareness around issues at the intersection of technology and economic equity. We advance public policy solutions to those issues, and we also produce corporate practice standards and frameworks to help companies who want to do better to enact better practices and standards internally. And our main focus is in housing and workforce and labor issues. The topic of the conversation today is going to cover all of that and more, and I'm really excited to get into it. But first, just a couple of housekeeping items. So we enforce a code of conduct at all of our events, and our community manager, Herman Calderon, is going to post a copy of it in the chat for you to view if you want to see more details. But in short, we just ask that you all respect your fellow attendees and participants. We want everybody to be curious and get as much out of this as they can. So we've left the chat open and hope that you'll converse with each other. But please do so in a respectful way and in a way that allows everybody to get what they came here for, which is to learn. We also will have an audience Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, we ask that you please use the Q&A feature, not the chat. So if you have a question that you want to put to Malcolm, please use the Q&A function. We are recording this event, and we will be sharing out the recording via email. So if you want it to refer to later or to share with your friends and colleagues, you'll be getting a follow-up email after the event. And we're also joined by our ASL interpreter, Julie. If you want to turn on the interpretation, select American Sign Language in the interpretation feature at the bottom of your screen. And big thanks to Julie for keeping up with us as I try not to speak too quickly. Okay, so we're going to get right into it. I'm so pleased to welcome Malcolm Harris. Malcolm, thank you for joining us. This is your second book, Palo Alto, A History of, sorry, now I'm not seeing the title anymore. California, Capitalism, and what was the last thing?
Well, just the world, that whole rest of the thing,
okay.
right?
Yeah. All 700 short, pithy pages. So I guess maybe just to start, I'd be curious to hear why you wrote this book, and what you hope readers will take away from it.
Well, I wrote it as we all do for money. So the question is why this particular one for money? Uh, and for writers in my cohort, especially those of us without terminal degrees who still want to do serious critical work, one of the ways to access the authority to do that kind of work these days is by picking a subject where you can include your personal story. And you go, straight history, my history, straight history, my history. And there are a lot of younger writers who are really good at that kind of mode. And so that's how I pitched it to my publisher, and that's how they bought it. And I did a sort of a bait and switch where I pulled out all that personal stuff. So if you want to find out about me, sorry, it's not in this book. It's just about Palo Alto, except maybe a little bit in the beginning. But I did grow up in Palo Alto. I spent ages 8 to 18 living in Palo Alto, and I'm very much a product of Palo Alto and the Palo Alto system. And I think if any of us really want to understand how to act in this world, part of that means understanding our own foundations critically and understand what you already exist here to do, and what's constraining the development of your individuality already. So much of my person was constructed and built around Palo Alto, this place that I thought I understood, but no one had really done the history all the way through. And I can say that without pissing off any academics, because really no one has even said that they've done this. There's a lot of official history of Palo Alto and the Bay Area, and especially the tech industry, that some of you might all know. But almost all of that jumps around. So you'll start with the gold rush and then you'll jump to post-World War II, or you'll start with the gold rush and jump to the radio age, or you'll skip the radio age and go right to the internet and compare the internet to the gold rush. And the gold rush is a great all-purpose metaphor, but no one had done it step by step through all the way from the beginning of this town in the 1870s to today in the 21st century, and tried to understand the totality of that history as something worth examining in all of its specifics, not oriented around business and the development of like the tech industry that sees that as an endpoint and sort of figuring the history backwards, but really seeing this place in its global context and in the true historical context.
Yeah, I mean, you say that, although I do read it as having a point of view. Like you're definitely viewing that history through a lens, and making an argument to a certain extent. So it's not simply a pure history, I guess I would say. And I'm
Well,
curious.
insofar as we all have methodologies, right?
Yeah,
Everyone's going to be writing from a position. And so for me, as a Marxist, I think that the premise of that belief is that history is the history of class conflict. So for me, to write an objective history is to write a Marxist history as a Marxist. And so the history as a history of class conflict is, from my point of view, the objective history of the place. And so that's what I set out to write.
Yeah, so I guess you're kind of getting ahead of my next question, which is, to that, that question of perspective. It is a very thorough history. I mean, you start well before even Palo Alto is incorporated as a city. I'm curious what you view as the through line, I guess related to class, but maybe if you can expand on that a little bit more, from that really sort of pre-incorporation time period through to the current time.
Well, the nice thing is that my central object provides that through line, right? So you have Palo Alto, which is founded at this period in the 1870s, and that takes us through to today. And so the question of like, why start where I start? The answer is Palo Alto and the preconditions, right? If I want to examine this place. But because of what Palo Alto is and where it stands in that history, I think that allows me to examine a particular period in world history, which is the period of world capitalism. And so there's a lot of debate about where and when capitalism starts as a phenomenon. I've seen arguments about East Indian commercial trading. You see arguments about British agriculture. You see arguments about like the colonization of Newfoundland's fisheries in the 17th century. You know, there's a lot of different perspectives about like where the behaviors and practices of capitalism sort of pop up in the world and distinguish themselves from feudal or other kinds of social relations. But there's not much debate about when capitalism becomes a global system that integrates for the first time everywhere in the world into one system of production and distribution. And that happens in the second half of the 19th century with the incorporation of California, but not just California, it's with the incorporation of China, Japan, Australia, and this Pacific area. And so you get sort of the buckling of the belt of capitalism around the world that brings forth a new epoch and a unified global epoch for the first time at this time. And it's not a coincidence that Palo Alto starts at the same time that this true global history starts. It's not a coincidence. It's a product of the same forces, a direct product. And we can talk about that as we go on.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the next obvious question is, what is it about Palo Alto? If I live on the other side of the planet, why should I be interested in Palo Alto as sort of a locus of the evolution of modern global capitalism?
Yeah, when I started this project and started like pitching this project or working through it, which was 2019, you know, not very long ago, I anticipated that that was going to be the main question that I got along the whole thing is like, why Palo Alto? You know, is Palo Alto really that important? Or like, don't you mean San Francisco? Isn't San Francisco the really important place? Or certainly San Jose, that's a valid point. Someone should write a book at least this long that is a history of San Jose in the same way, and we would all learn a lot from that. But since it's come out, basically no one has asked that from anywhere in the world that's talked to me. And I've gotten so much more, in fact, global pickup on this book than I imagined I was going to, because people everywhere now understand that Palo Alto relates directly to their daily life of individuals around the world. And that's a very new phenomenon, even just in the past couple years.
Yeah, I guess it's curious to me that even from 2019, what do you think changed in the last 4 years?
Just the size of Palo Alto's footprint in the world, just in a quantitative sense, has grown immensely during that period. So the fact that we're all on Zoom and communicating through this computer technology, and that so much of work now is taking place mediated by tech companies that come out of the Bay Area, right? Cisco WebEx is not a new technology or a new company. But Zoom stands for so much more than that, right? Even though it's a spinoff of the same thing. And now, so people's understanding of tech and Palo Alto in their lives is a little more like Zoom than it is like Cisco WebEx, which is how it used to be. And so it's got a brand name now in everyone's actual existence.
Yeah, so when when you're talking to those audiences, what are they? I mean, I guess there must be some implication that they understand the impact that this place has on their lives and the importance for them of understanding its history. How are they experiencing that impact, and why in what way is it reflected in the way that they're conversing with you about how they need to think about the history of this place?
Yeah, mostly negatively, right? It seems to be impacting people in a really negative sense, in terms of their labor relations, even their like intimate relations, in terms of internet dating, their relations to media and like movies and art, and like we have a Silicon Valley sort of level of mediation now between anything we might do and our existence. Even something like Spotify or whatever is totally mediating people's relationships through to music, even though Spotify is not obviously a Bay Area company. And I think people at the same time as they're finding themselves compelled to use these technologies constantly in their daily lives, are pretty aware that they resent them at the same time, right? And they have a negative orientation towards the domination of their lives by tech and by Palo Alto. And certainly if you go to San Francisco these days and you talk to people who've lived there for a long time about the relationship between Palo Alto and San Francisco, they can point to the last 10 years and the sort of change in that relation, where you now have something like San Francisco acting as a suburb of Palo Alto rather than the other way around. And these are dramatic changes that people have observed, even as they feel themselves complicit in them.
Okay, so let's back up for a minute before I go too far down this path. So how did we get here? I'm wondering, I know this is maybe difficult to do given the length of the history, but can you just walk people through what you think are sort of some of the most critical milestones in getting where we are now, and how Palo Alto is sort of established itself as this place? It didn't sort of spring up out of thin air. So give us a little bit of that timeline.
Sure. It's a good question. So the story of Anglo-American colonization of Alta California starts with genocide, obviously, in post-Gold Strike, where you've got 150,000 indigenous people who constitute the bulk of the population of Alta California. Spanish colonization that yields Mexican territorial ownership is really thin in the area. And so these California bunch of dudes who are these Anglo-Americans are able to take political possession of the territory very easily. Only a few shots are even fired in the battle for California. It's this really comedic exchange. But then when the militias come in and start clearing the land, they derive access to that territory by committing some of the most brutal acts of genocide in the modern age. And the fact that this happens during the Civil War period means it's sort of effaced in American history. We don't teach what they're now calling the American genocide as part of American history, but I think that's starting to change. So preview, new American history. American genocide is how Anglo-American domination of Alta California starts.
Safe to say it won't be taught in Florida public schools.
Yeah. And so one of those guys who's involved in that process is governor at one point, in addition to being the putative head of the railroad, is this guy named Leland Stanford, and he lives on the top of the nicest hill in San Francisco. Was called Nabob Hill for the people who lived on there. Now it's shortened to Nob Hill. You might have heard of it. And it's a very nice place to live, except all the workers also know where you live. And there was an association called the Working Men, which was an affiliate of the First International in the 1870s. And they would demonstrate outside Leland Stanford's house and say, you need to fire all your Chinese workers that he'd hired that they thought attacked their place in the labor hierarchy, which was true. And you need to fire all those Chinese workers or we're going to come get you in your house. And instead of complying with the working men, of course, Leland Stanford, in addition to having them arrested, takes his family and moves to the suburbs. Except there are no suburbs yet in the 1870s. And so he has to invent a suburb, and he calls that suburb Palo Alto. And so that's the origin of Palo Alto. It's a direct outcome of these class tensions of the 1870s. If you need to escape the workers that you hired with the money that you made off them, you run to the suburbs and surround yourself with servants. And so
it's quite an American storyline, isn't it?
Right. And it's foundational of this sort of new American history that starts in the 1870s, right? This is the foundation of a new country. And we talk about that mostly in terms of the South and Reconstruction, but the inclusion of the West Coast and California is absolutely a part of that era. And Palo Alto is a product of that era as much as, the defeat of Reconstruction is. And in fact, when California comes into the Union, one of the first things it does is team up with the South to end Reconstruction and pass the Chinese Exclusion Act in the early 1880s. And so this sort of racial division is foundational to California's entry into the Union and its emergence as an important part of the United States. Fast forward a little bit to the 20th century, which is really only around the corner. And that's part of something that people need to understand about this history, is that it's so short, under 200 years for the total history of Anglo-Americans in California as territorial dominators. 20th century, there is anti-colonial communist uprising around the world. And Palo Alto is sort of tasked with, how are you going to maintain the security of this new class of Western colonizers in a world that is all of the sudden on the precipice of war for equality? If you can't maintain our colonies, if we can't maintain domination over the rest of the world, how are we going to maintain our position vis-a-vis everyone else? And the answer they sort of come up with is technology. And so this is where you see the development of the radio age around Palo Alto, where they're looking for how are you going to develop tools to help you drop bombs on people who are far away from you so that you can kill them without risking your own life. That is how they're going to be able to maintain uh, minoritarian domination over the world into the 20th century. Now, we can jump forward again to the post-World War II era, where again they're confronted with the further development of this same problem. That there's a world anti-colonial revolution. The colonies have now cast off their colonizers. Indonesia is free. The Dutch is never going to get it back. Mao is on the march in China. What are you going to do? And Palo Alto is once again tasked with solving this problem. And the answer is the silicon chip, which the entire first generation of silicon chips goes into the Minuteman I nuclear missile, which is a gun pointed at the world's head that says, if anything happens to America, this whole place is going to go. And this is Palo Alto's contribution to world history. And from there, I don't want to take up too much time on this one answer, but from there, we're already at Silicon Valley, right? So the products of Silicon Valley were really only a couple historical steps from this 19th century colonialism to the industry of today.
So it's not necessarily obvious to me on the face of it why all those things happened in Palo Alto. Like, why wouldn't they, I don't know, happen in like Corpus Christi or somewhere? I mean, was there something specifically?
Or why not New York, right? Where all the money is? Why would it happen in California? It's a great question.
Well, I mean, I guess I didn't say a big city because, there was other stuff going on there at the time, but it seems like Palo Alto is just such a random place in many ways of like, there's nothing on the face of it, at least as far as I can see, that in 1920 was particularly distinguishing from some other sort of, medium small town in the US. So was there something specific about what was happening here, or was it really just an accident?
Well, it was a combination of a couple things. So part of it was Stanford University. And so from the beginning, the first, Stanford startup really is Federal Telegraph, which is the radio company that develops the triode, which is essentially the transistor before the transistor. And really is like the triode's invention at Federal Telegraph by Lee DeForest, who's the inventor, is like, a transistor is a triode, right? A triode really just developed when you think of like computers that are made out of light bulbs or whatever, those are triodes. And that was invented in Palo Alto way before anyone had thought about working with silicon to do anything. And that was invented there partly because they had a bunch of engineers in Palo Alto that had been built off the gold rush and the post-gold rush mining engineering industries, which was, of course, global imperialism, concentrated around Palo Alto. They had they in fact intentionally devoted themselves to building an engineering school and a school full of engineers. So they had that there. They were also far away from the East Coast. And so Lee DeForest, who's the inventor, was sort of fleeing prosecution in New York because his last venture had been sort of a stock scam. And he finds himself, he runs away to California because that's where you can sort of escape. And although he is eventually arrested out there too. But so California at the time has this synthesis between scammers and but also the techno capital foundation of Stanford.
Sounds like we haven't changed much.
No, we really haven't. It's funny. I wonder how many people know about Lee DeForest and his history, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, okay. So I want to spend the rest of our time talking about more present day issues and how this all manifests in the current moment. I guess, this has been, all of these things have sort of crystallized into sort of a social, cultural, economic picture of the place, a set of characteristics. I guess, how would you describe that politics of, I'm going to say Silicon Valley from now on, because I think Palo Alto is really, in many ways, the capital of Silicon Valley. How would you how would you describe where the politics are now?
Well, I think the politics are actually very close to how they've been the whole time. And that's something that I think that even the people who hold them don't quite understand because they don't know their own history. It's not very popular to know your history in Silicon Valley because it gets in the way with selling disruption, right? If you know a lot about what happened, you can't sell the idea that you've come up with something completely new because often you haven't. It's something that already exists. Um, so yeah, it's hard to say. Sorry, I lost my place on the question. Repeat it one more time.
Just like what the politics of the place are.
Oh, right. Yeah. So if you go back to the like foundation, the first president of Stanford University is a guy named David Starr Jordan, who's a like world important eugenicist. And that the politics of eugenics and the American empire, and he was tasked with really this question of how do we protect the Anglo-American genes going forward in this world of conflict. And that's something that California has taken very seriously, and Palo Alto and Silicon Valley in particular has taken really seriously. If you look at someone like Bill Shockley, who is the godfather of Silicon Valley. He's the one who brings silicon to Silicon Valley, in addition to being a Nobel Prize winner who invents the point contact transistor. And again, same exact politics. And if you look in his like biography, his biographer is like, oh, I have no idea where these crazy racist eugenics politics came from. It must have been, somewhere extraneous, it couldn't have been from California, but it's obviously the exact same politics repeated over again. And we see the same thing today, where the same sort of eugenic nationalism is getting more popular and more like sayable, right? And you see like the teal folks, and which is a much broader network, I think, than people understand it to be, repeating again really Shockley-esque politics or Jensen-esque politics once again, that are about the preservation of the white race, for lack of a better term. And like the political versions of that are different than, it's not like libertarian, right? People think that, oh, that means that these people are like libertarians. And then they look at like the Silicon Valley Bank bailout and they're really confused. They're like, if you're libertarians, then why do you want a government bailout for your bank? Wouldn't you not want that? Isn't that the whole point? And the answer is that they're not libertarians. They're what's called associationists, which goes back to Herbert Hoover, who was the first Stanford engineer back in the day, as well as president of the United States. And his idea was that groups of capitalists, groups of men, groups of interested stakeholders should be the ones who decide how things go. That all power is sort of private power of the interested cabal, and that's what government's job is, to facilitate those groups of men. And so if you look at Peter Thiel's, the meeting that he arranged with all the tech leadership and President Trump early in Trump's, what I hope will be his only term, that's like a perfect example of associationist politics, where you've got like all the tech leadership, like really CEO level, founder level folks. People should like pull up that video if they haven't seen it, going around the table with the president of the United States. And the president is saying, how can I help you make the tech industry great? How can I support your work as the tech industry? How can we work together? And it's after that meeting that a lot of these tech firms start applying for prime defense contracts. And that's associationism, and that's not clearly not libertarianism. If you're meeting personally with the president to like work on your business together,
Yeah, I mean, there is the thing that kind of struck me, and I don't know why this hadn't occurred to me before I read the book, but there is this very strange, I don't know if it's a dichotomy or sort of like cognitive dissonance in the politics of Silicon Valley in particular, but kind of the Bay Area generally, which is like, on the one hand, counterculture, or sort of there's a, counterculture and sort of radical left also has a very rich and deep history here. And at the same time, like hardcore commitment to suburbanization and segregation and the defense military industrial complex on the other. And I'm just curious, like, as I was reading, wanting to just like hear from you about what you thought about that dichotomy and how they interact together, and are there do you see like results of that are particularly consequential in our world and our economy now?
Yeah, it's a tough question because the historiography has been, I think, so bad. And so our understanding of the relationships of that period is dominated by two narratives that I like to describe as: the hippies invented the computer and the internet, and that's good. And there's the hippies invented the computer and the internet, and that's bad. And so in the first version, it's like the the lyricists for the Grateful Dead invented the internet, right? It's like the hippies were all hanging out and Steve Jobs took acid, and like that's how we get the era of the personal computer and the internet. And the other version is like more or less the same, but instead it says, these guys were neoliberals and they were sort of feckless and they were individualist and they didn't realize what they were doing. And that's why they invented this like super capitalist world of the 80s, even though they were, counterculture hippie guys. I think both of those stories are basically wrong. And that's a point I really try hard to make in the book, is the conflation between the counterculture, which included like many, many people of many different political orientations, and the left, and especially the new left, is incorrect. And so you have someone like Stuart Brand, who's like dean of the counterculture, whole earth catalog, whatever. He's a right-wing guy his entire life. He's a capitalist, right-wing, pro-American, pro-military, pro-war. So he's pro-Vietnam War and pro-America winning the Vietnam War. Now, the new left at the same time is trying to bomb literally every computer center in America because they understand that computer centers are tool weapons in the Vietnam War, and they're trying to win the war for the North Vietnamese. And so you couldn't have any more separate, groups of people, right? They're literally fighting each other. And yet we have the conflation of these two groups in the history. And that's sort of the function of that, is to misunderstand the new left and their entire critique and everything that they were up to, right? And so if you look at an essay like The Californian Ideology, which is a very common like critical piece of writing about tech, it directly conflates the counterculture and the new left and says both are pro-technology. And if you have this understanding that like, oh, the new left was pro computers, you cannot understand what happened, which included, again, them constantly bombing computer centers in this whole period. And so that's the history that I'm interested in, is like the real social historical conflict between these two groups that were clearly at odds, rather than the sort of self-gratifying hippies invented the computer story, where they were, against the war, and pro-computer, even though the computers were the war.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's really helpful for a lot of people, including myself, who, spent a lot of time trying to understand like how this industry that is, ostensibly liberal, has become so sort of, I guess, unequal and not liberal, like in the traditional like definition of the word.
Yeah, David Packard is someone who's like, when I was growing up, he was the example of Palo Alto liberalism. Any philanthropy, anything that's going on in the Bay Area has Packard Foundation, David Packard's name on it. David Packard was Deputy Secretary of Defense for Nixon during the Vietnam War. They firebombed Bill Hewlett's house during the Vietnam War because these guys were war criminals, as the left understood them, right? There was a chant on the left, they used to chant Packard before Calley. And Lieutenant Calley was the most notorious war criminal of the Vietnam era, right? They like tried to effect a people's arrest on David Packard, right? So when people say like, oh, people are really critical towards like tech leaders these days, it's like they tried to kill tech leaders back in the day because they understood that they were war criminals. Like that's very far from where we are now. And certainly it wasn't anything like liberal about what they were doing, right? Being Deputy Secretary of Defense for Nixon during Vietnam is like, if things go differently, you are tried as a war criminal.
Mm. Yeah, okay, so I want to get into labor because I mean, it's clearly a huge part of the book. And I want to spend some time, so it's something that we think about a lot, obviously, at Tech Equity. I do want to say, for those who are watching, we'll go to Q&A after this little section. So if you have questions, please drop them in the chat now. I want to read a little passage, if you don't mind, just so I
Please.
the conversation about labor. Firms adapted a bifurcated labor model holding manufacturing wages 20% below the national average, while electronics professionals did significantly better financially than professionals in slower industries did. Again, this is no coincidence. Electronics firms rewarded their managers for controlling labor costs. It seems counterintuitive to pay some workers not to pay other workers, but by using stock options and grants to align professional employees' interests with ownership, firms could provide a paternalistic atmosphere for high-value engineers while keeping the aggregate wage low enough to generate double-digit profits even as prices fell. So I think that's really interesting in the context of the work that we do, which has been, over when I started Tech Equity in 2016, we were really talking about an extremely privileged set of workers who everybody thought were just sort of doing better than anybody, right, at the time, and in part because they had ownership stakes in the companies that they were building. But that did create a certain dynamic where they were much less willing to challenge power. It wasn't in their interest. And there was also, at the time, extremely invisible, now becoming more visible, in part because of the work that Tech Equity is doing, a sort of underclass of workers that held the industry up in many ways. That has really changed a lot over the last 5 years. So I'm wondering, one, if you can just speak to that larger dynamic of, tech workers is sort of unique in the sense that they had stakes in the companies and were aligned with the owners of capital in this case, but also how that relationship has really shifted in light of layoffs, in light of protests, employee kind of uprisings against their employers, increased unionization among tech workers. What do you make of all of that?
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic situation. I mean, the history of organizing in tech is hard, and the history of organizing in California, manufacturing and production labor is hard. And so there's been very, very, up till now, till the 21st century, almost no attempts to unionize the professional side of Silicon Valley labor, because people have been totally uninvested in that identity of even thinking of themselves as laborers. I think part of that has to do with stock options, which again, HP introduces as a way of cutting their labor costs originally, because it's a way to get new investment. Because stock options are a great way. You're basically getting your employees to loan you their pay back to you, and in exchange for doing that, you get to raise money. And instead of giving away power to some like new active outside investor, 100 different employees with their little tiny share can't really make any changes on management. And so it's a way of pulling in more money, of investment money, without giving up power, which you'd think would be the opposite to giving power to workers, but that's not actually what it was. So that was pretty effective for the firms, and it's been made organizing on that level very difficult. There've been plenty of organizing attempts to organize manufacturing labor, on the chip lines when there's a bunch of manufacturing labor being done in Silicon Valley. And the effects of that, or one of the outcomes of that conflict, was the bifurcation of manufacturing and design labor and the shipping of manufacturing labor overseas, which then makes it harder to organize across those lines. Where you have, and I think you alluded to, the most successful tech labor organizing has been in service and support workers. So like janitorial workers for a long time were the only ones who've had unions in Silicon Valley. Period, right? The only people at Apple who had a union were the janitors. And that's because they organized better. Now, we're seeing people like more interested in their own position as laborers, I think, as these firms right now have moved to show Wall Street that they can control their labor costs. So I think that's what these layoffs were about, not any about really like operational efficiency, so much as showing Wall Street that that even though you're dependent on all these like high priced tech workers, don't worry, I can still fire 5,000 people whenever I feel like it. We still have that flexibility. And we've seen, the market reward them immensely immediately for these activities, even though, again, the like connection to production efficiency is really obscure. So I guess to end it, I think overcoming that division by like nationality and kind of work is going to be really important moving forward, is to like organize up and down the production cycle. So even if you're not able to unionize your entire cohort of white collar workers at Apple or whatever, organizing across national lines with the production workers and with production workers who are also involved in organizing and also involved in disrupting the system of production, is one way to knit that back together, what's been torn apart, because that tearing apart's been very, very useful for disorganizing labor.
And I guess for to the extent that there are tech workers watching or listening or will be listening, I wonder how you think they should think about their role in this story. They are in many ways have been, were central characters in the history that you tell. How does that storyline continue for them in your eyes, given where we are today in the history of labor tech relations?
Yeah, they're right in the middle of it, right? In some ways. So they should expect to see the conditions of their labor getting worse, because that's what's happened to all other workers. And even though they've been part of the process, as in the passage you described, that they've been sort of bought off as part of that process or bribed as part of that process in order to write the code to make it happen, that they're not exempt from it. And I think we're seeing that now, or people are seeing that now, that they are not exempt from the broad tendencies that immiserate the working class and are in fact subject to them. So yeah, things are getting worse. You're not wrong to see it that way, and they're going to keep getting worse, and it's because of your place in the production system.
On that happy note, everybody, yes, we're going to move to Q&A. So I'm going to invite Marian Wellington, our Director of Communications, into the conversation, who's been keeping an eye on what's happening in the chat and the Q&A. Marian, what's out there?
Yeah. And first of all, thank you for this discussion. It's been really eye-opening, especially as someone who grew up in the Bay. It's been fun to hear about our history. So thank you. We've gotten some fun questions in the chat. One of the questions, I think this is maybe a two-parter, is just can you speak a little bit more about the relationship between government and tech, both from the beginning, but then also today, especially as they, whether or not or how they work together to track and monitor US citizens?
Great question, because it's one that we totally get wrong, and there are a lot of different versions. There's definitely a version. So the self-fashioned libertarian version is, we did it by ourselves out here in California. We're the entrepreneurs. We don't have any association with the government or even big capital. We're just a bunch of gold rush, minor entrepreneur types. And people know that that's not really true. And so then there's the second narrative of like, well, the government paid for the internet because of their association with the defense departments, and there was a lot of like government money behind the research and development behind these commercial technologies. But the government didn't really get anything out of it because it wasn't really a smart investment. And actually they triggered this, private revolution and accidentally saved the economy by giving us a bunch of money, which is again a different sort of like self-fashioned narrative. But the truth is that government money goes back all the way to the beginning, and the relationship has been kind of complicated. And so during the radio age and going back to the radio age and Herbert Hoover, you see the government setting up through these associational models, the foundation for the tech industry, saying, we're going to help you, we're going to support the airline industry, we're going to support the avionics industry, we're going to support the radio industry, for our military health, but also for our commercial health. And we're going to juice this like stock boom in airline stocks to create the airline industry, which is very, very important for the early electronics industry. Is basically the airline. They're the same thing. And so from the beginning, government's playing this really important role. In the New Deal era, you have the government step in and say, look, you tech entrepreneurs are doing really great. We love what you're doing. We need you to keep doing it, but your profits are too high and we need to absorb you into larger structures so that you can do what you do for the total of society. And we need to control what you're doing now because it's important enough to what we're doing that we need to be in charge of it. And this is like a foundational trauma for the tech industry. Is like FDR tried to take away my profits. Like this happens to David Packard personally. The war negotiation board comes to him and says, you're making too much money. And that this is a very, very important moment for Silicon Valley. And from then, they really shy away from direct contracting with the government and instead really try to stick to subcontracting and subcontracting, where the government is still going to be reliant on their chips. They're still going to be reliant on their database systems. They're still going to be reliant on the things that they produce. So they're going to have to buy them. But they don't have the command of a direct prime contractor relationship. You're going to work through Verizon, or you work through Raytheon, or you work through some of these companies whose job it is to work more hand in glove with the government. And that's worked very, very good for Silicon Valley, for a long time through the chip and the internet age. But as I alluded to more recently, now you see the government, a lot of these firms, Microsoft, Google, in the wake of that Peter Thiel meeting with Donald Trump, moving into prime contractor roles where they're competing with, instead of just contracting to the Raytheons or the Verizons of the world, and going straight for direct government military contracts, which has spurred a lot of pushback from tech workers who are not used to seeing their work being used in prime government contracts. They might be, they had the deniability of the subcontracting, which the left was really critical in the 60s of tech workers for saying, like, look, I don't know how they use my stuff. I just make something and they put it in something. I don't know. What's that relationship to napalm bombing? Can't tell me. But when you know that you're working on drone strikes, all right, when you're making it very clear, it's a little tougher to ignore that connection. But it's important to understand that as a real shift that's happened more recently in the relationship between the government and tech. And Tech Inquiry's done a really good job of like focusing on that directly.
Cool. This is maybe a large question, but quite simply put, is tech too far gone? Is there any way to change course? Do you see a bright future that could be possible in which tech is not as disastrous in impact as it is today?
I think it's important to divorce the idea of like technology as like things people make to make our world better or to make our world different or more efficient from the like American tech industry, which is a very, 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 very specific historical project. So like in Yugoslavia, in the early video game, they had this early video game system that distributed new games over the radio because they had computers that would run off audio tapes. And so you would, when they were going to put out a new game, you just set your tape recorder to record and they would put out a bunch of beeps, and then you'd record the game and then you'd put it in your game player and you could play the new game. That's awesome. Like that's the internet distribution of games, like way before we came up with like Steam or whatever today. And that was because they were devoted to the idea of spreading this technology as fast as possible to as many people as possible. And radio is a great way to do that. And you can transfer code over the radio. We could still do that if we want, like that's brilliant. That's technology, right? That's awesome technology. Trinary computing comes out of the Soviet Union, right? Like people have been working on all sorts of different technologies forever. But like the American tech industry is a very, very, very particular thing, subset of that, even though it has come to stand for the idea of technology itself. And you have this sort of, Moore's law, or all sorts of laws. Silicon Valley starts issuing laws, and those laws always have to do with money somehow. And they're not like laws of physics. They're not laws of chemistry. They're policies made by these people, right? They're production targets. If you put out and say, this is how cheap it should get, and this is how much more powerful it should get, those become production targets, and that's what you devote yourself to doing. And that becomes technology, capital T itself, which seems to unfold autonomously. And then you have people saying like, oh, well, of course, general artificial intelligence is the end point of technology. Like, that's obviously what comes next. It just goes in this direction, and nothing goes in any direction. You have to build stuff. So yeah, the nature of that.
I mean, it's interesting to me. I'm working on a book myself right now about venture capital. And I think, if there is a distinguishing factor of the American tech industry, it is venture capital, right? So the economic structure that underlies the industry. You talk about venture capital very little in the book, actually. I'm wondering, was that a choice, or how do you think about venture capital's role in this story? And, how should we think about venture capital's role in this story?
Yeah, venture capital is interesting because it is it's a brand. And so there's nothing that separates, venture capital per se from the investments that the associationists made in Theodore Judah's plan for a transcontinental railroad at the beginning of in the middle of the 19th century. Like, that's venture.
There are some differences, but yes, I mean, in general, I get what you mean. It is, I mean, there are specific infrastructural, substantive.
Yes, and certainly the shift of American capital into these firms has to do with a particular set of deregulatory shifts that have to happen around, like, who's allowed to invest under what conditions.
And just the governance and tax rules around them are an innovation, like since the 70s, really.
Yes, but I don't think that's the decisive thing that happens in the 70s. I think that is a product of the like a C factor, right? It's so you say like, and actually, I know someone who is working on like this exact question. I think it's Mal Sauder is working on this exact question right now. So it's definitely one that we need more research about, especially because a lot of the stuff about venture capital is written by and maybe sometimes for venture capitalists.
Yeah.
And a lot of those studies are not like particularly sharp and are very like great man histories. So like, I think that's important, but it has to do with the like global production situation, and has to do with the financialization of production in general, as a solution to the global production glut that you face, and the lack of opportunities for highly profitable investment. And so we're seeing that, like, if anything, venture capital is a problem, or like a solution to a problem that this system runs into in the 70s and 80s that we're still running into over and over again. And I think that's sort of the answer for why this Palo Alto won't die, or tech won't die. When people when this last sort of bubble popped, when people talk about bubble popping or whatever, and they said like, surely this is it. This is the last time, like, tech's really done for now. Once they raise the interest rates, it's game over. Like, the whole tech and just all the froth is going to go out of it. And we haven't seen that. In fact, we've seen the opposite. We've seen the immediate inflation of a new bubble around, these artificial intelligence software companies. And that's because the whole system still suffers from the same problem. And the VCs are still the guys whose job it is, and I say guys as a gendered term intentionally because it's a highly gendered industry, whose job it is to solve that problem of not having enough places to profitably invest for production growth. And so their job for the last 50 years has been to tell cool stories about how they're going to invent something new that's really going to trigger growth again. And they've been doing that since the beginning. And the internet's a classic example where it's a story they told about how they're going to revolutionize production, that then never actually shows up in the production statistics, which is a famous quote by Fred Turner, and one that Paul Krugman gets a lot of flack, I think, for repeating, which is that the internet did not actually cause some production jump, which it didn't. And so, yeah, maybe I didn't include them specifically because they're so used to seeing themselves and positioning themselves as agents in this history. And I think of them really as cogs, very, very much so as cogs in this machine, more so even than other players, that their sort of response is very mechanical, and our need for their function is very mechanical. But I don't think VCs understand what their job is in a historical sense. And I think part of their job, if this makes sense, is to not understand what their job is in a historical sense, because then they can keep coming up with grand new ideas that, again, aren't going to do what they need them to do.
Well, we will have a chance to see whether they are truly as goldfishian as we think they are when this cycle comes back. As you said, it's already starting to come back around.
The metaverse, anyone hanging out in the metaverse lately? Anyone been working on the metaverse lately?
I mean, I wouldn't sleep on Web3. I think, it could come back as quickly as it went away. Marion, sorry for that little diversion.
No problem.
Any last question?
Yeah, one or two if we have the time. Someone asked what your thoughts are on the possibilities around sectoral bargaining for tech workers and beyond.
Good luck. That's you'd have to organize a lot of people. And I think that's might be in some ways easier to get started at the sectoral level, because at the workplace level, it can be very difficult, and you risk people cracking down on you. And so I think some of the projects like the Tech Workers Organizing Committee are working sort of at the sectoral level, because it's a lot easier to organize at that level. And the consequences you can face at that level are smaller, at least for now. I haven't heard about any industry-wide blacklists about people doing labor organizing yet. Maybe you all have heard of them, but that I haven't seen that yet. But in terms of actual then steps about how you're going to organize demands and effectuate demands at the sectoral level, you have to organize a lot of people, or you'd have to get the people that you have organized pretty radical and be willing to take some big steps, or else it's going to be hard to make a splash. So I think there's a reason we've seen development in that direction, and I don't think it's unpromising, especially in terms of education. But in terms of labor capital conflict, it's a tricky place to be in.
Yeah, makes sense. One more question and then I'll pass it back to you, Catherine. Any final advice for tech workers who are trying to change the industry from the inside?
Trying to change the industry from the inside.
As you will.
Yeah, learning about the history is really important. I think just political development in general, and getting involved politically in your community, maybe not even as a tech worker, but as someone who lives in your community. Get involved with tenant organizing if you're a tenant, right? Get involved in neighborhood organizing. And maybe
they live in Palo Alto, even.
Maybe they live in Palo Alto. They can organize for more housing.
Inclusionary zoning, yes, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And so there are a lot of places to get involved politically, even outside your gig as a tech worker. And the more that you're able, and then also make that a part of your daily life, right? If you wear that at work too, and you organize for your housing group, or you're organizing for what your tenants group or whatever, you can do that at work as well. So do that at your bus stop, do that at your Google bus stop, or so workplace organizing doesn't also just have to be about workplace conditions. It's also a place of your life that you can organize from. So
Well, I think this has been great food for thought. I really appreciate you chatting with us about it and making a pretty dense history so accessible. It's definitely, we definitely agree with you that knowing your history is really critical part of being an effective citizen, and in such an ahistorical place, where, as you said, the histories are so incomplete. We're just very thankful that you've taken a crack at it from your perspective. So thanks again for joining us. As I said, everyone, you'll get the recording by email, and we hope that you will join us for our next conversation. Thanks, Malcolm.
Thanks again. Thanks for having me.
Bye.